Before we dive in, if you've been wanting to grow your podcast without spending hours on marketing every single week, I have something for you. Hot Pod Summer Camp is a free 3-day live challenge happening from June 9th through June 11th, where we use AI to build the systems that grow your show all summer long, even when you're at the pool with a drink in your hand. It's only 1 hour a day and it's completely free. You can grab your spot by going to podcastingformoms.co/summer. All right, let's get into the episode. Hosting every week does not automatically make your podcast strategic. And honestly, this is where I think a lot of podcasters get stuck because they assume if they're consistent enough, if they create enough episodes, if they keep showing up long enough, eventually their podcast will grow. And eventually it will generate leads, eventually it'll convert, and eventually it'll start working. But the truth is, you do not need more content. You need better alignment. Because there is a huge difference between a hobby podcast and a strategic podcast. And today we're going to be breaking down exactly what that difference is, because if your podcast feels like it's taking a ton of effort without creating real momentum in your business, this episode is probably going to explain why. Let's jump in. Welcome to Podcasting for Moms, the show for moms in business ready to start, grow, and scale a podcast that turns their listeners into buyers. I'm Jenny Sonnesen, a podcast strategist and fellow mom entrepreneur. You're in the right place if you want to learn how to start and grow a podcast that attracts your ideal clients and really does the heavy lifting for you when it comes to selling your offers, all while balancing life as a busy mom. Are you ready to create a podcast that grows your income, impact, and influence? Let's make podcasting work for you, because as moms, we know how to get things done. All right, let's jump into the episode. Hey, and welcome back to Podcasting for Moms, the podcast where we talk about launching, growing, and scaling a podcast in a way that actually supports your business in real life. I'm your host, Jenny Sonnesen, and today we're going to be talking about something that might feel a little spicy, but honestly, it is a conversation that we need to have. Because there's absolutely nothing wrong with podcasting as a hobby. There's nothing wrong with podcasting because you love it. There's also nothing wrong with using your show as a creative outlet. And lastly, there's nothing wrong with simply wanting to share your thoughts and have conversations online. But if your goal is to grow your business, generate leads, book clients, sell offers, build authority, or create long-term momentum, then your podcast cannot operate like a hobby. And I think this is where so many podcasters unintentionally stay stuck, because they're creating content consistently, but they're not creating strategically. So in this episode, I want to break down the actual difference between a hobby podcast and a strategic podcast, the mistakes I personally used to make, why consistency alone is not enough, and the shifts that actually turn your podcast into a business asset instead of just another piece of content that you're constantly trying to keep up with. Let's get into it. So first, let's start with what I personally consider a hobby podcast. Again, not here to be judgmental, just observational. So in my opinion, a hobby podcast tends to sound like, what do I feel like talking about this week? Whereas a strategic podcast sounds like, what does my audience need to hear in order to move towards the next step? That is a massive difference. A hobby podcast is often random episode topics and consistent messaging, content without a clear goal, no listener journey or strategic call to action, and no real connection between the podcast and the business itself. It is essentially creating content in a vacuum. And honestly, I used to do this too. I used to think, well, if I just say consistent enough, it's eventually going to grow. I focused way too much on downloads and way too little on conversion. I would create episodes with no call to action, no strategic next step, and no intentional listener journey. And I see this all the time now when I audit podcasts. Someone has 80 episodes, 100 episodes, sometimes even 200 episodes, and they are absolutely exhausted because they've built a content machine instead of a growth engine. And those are not the same thing. Because here's the truth that no one really talks about. Consistency alone is not enough. You can be incredibly consistent and still completely misaligned. You can post every single week and still confuse your audience. And you can have great content and still struggle to convert listeners into leads or clients. And honestly, visibility without strategy tends to create burnout, because eventually you start asking, why am I working this hard for so little return? And that's usually the moment that podcasters realize that they don't actually have a content problem. They have a strategy problem. So let's talk about what makes a podcast strategic, because a strategic podcast is built differently from the ground up. A strategic podcast has intentional messaging. It knows who it's for, what transformation it supports, what conversations it wants to own, and what action it wants listeners to take. Every episode is not just content, it is a part of a larger ecosystem. And this is something I teach constantly. Your podcast should support your business, not become another full-time job inside of your business. All of your episodes should have a purpose, not in a robotic way or in every episode needs to be a hard sell kind of way, but in a what is this episode helping my audience understand, believe, or do next kind of way. That's strategy. A strategic podcast also thinks about audience first planning, meaning you're not just creating what you want to say, you're creating content around your audience's questions, pain points, beliefs, search behavior, buying behavior, and desired outcomes. And this is why discoverability matters. This is why messaging matters. This is why SEO matters. And this is why positioning matters, because strategic podcasters understand that good content alone does not guarantee growth. You need alignment, clarity, and intentionality. And I want you to know that some of the most successful podcasts are not the ones with the biggest audiences. They're the ones with the clearest messaging and the strongest listener trust. Because a strategic podcast nurtures people, it builds relationships, it creates movement, and it guides listeners somewhere. And one of the biggest differences between hobby podcasters and strategic podcasters understand that downloads are not the only metric that matter. Because I would much rather have 200 highly aligned listeners that actually convert than 10,000 random downloads from people who will never buy anything from me. And I know that sounds controversial in the online business space where everyone wants giant numbers, but in my opinion, conversion matters way more than vanity metrics. A strategic podcast is designed to create trust, authority, connection, and movement, not just noise. And I think a lot of podcasters are accidentally overcomplicating growth because they think the answer is more of everything, more content, more platforms, more episodes, more visibility, more marketing. But really, the answer is often better alignment. Stronger positioning, clearer messaging, more intentional CTAs, and more strategic content planning. Not more, but better. And I also want to say this because I think some people might need to hear it. If your podcast currently feels more like a hobby podcast, that does not mean that you've failed. It just means that you probably started before you fully understood strategy, which, to be fair, most of us probably did. Most podcasters start by just talking in a microphone and hoping that it works. And that's super normal. But eventually there comes a point where you have to decide, do I want a podcast that simply exists, or do I want a podcast that actually supports my business and creates momentum? Because those are two entirely different goals. And strategic podcasts are built with intention. So if you've been podcasting for a while and feeling frustrated, if you're putting out episodes consistently but you're not seeing traction, if your messaging feels messy, if your downloads are stagnant, and if listeners are not converting, I want you to stop assuming that you need more content. You probably just need better alignment. And sometimes you're simply too close to your own podcast to see those gaps clearly, which is exactly why I offer podcast audits, because most podcasters do not need to burn everything down and start over from scratch. Usually they just need strategic refinement. Things like better messaging, clearer positioning, stronger calls to action, more intentional episode strategy, and a more cohesive listener journey. Small shifts can create massive momentum. So if you want someone to take a look at your podcast strategically and identify the invisible growth problems you probably can't see for yourself, you can go and snag your podcast audit using the link in the show notes. I would love to help you turn your podcast from just content into an actual business asset. And just remember, you don't need more content, you need better alignment. And that shift changes everything. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. I'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning into Podcasting for Moms. I hope today's episode gave you the tools and inspiration you need to make your podcast work smarter, not harder. If you love what you heard, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It means the world and helps other moms in business find the show. For more tips, resources, and support, head to podcastingformoms.co. Remember, you're not just building a podcast, you're building your legacy. Until next time, friends.